I'll introduce myself as well, otherwise I don't think it would be fair. If you can go to the next slide, please, Nakiba. A little bit about me. As I said, the it's difficult to know about a poet unless you know where they're coming from. If any of us studied English language, literature, and we would study poets, authors, writers, we always talk about context. So this is my context. So I'm a 27-year-old working and living in London, specifically in the UK. UK, specifically in London, sorry. My background is I am Pakistani, so I am familiar with both Urdu and English. I can't say I'm completely fluent, but the reason I think that's somewhat useful for me is because, as one of the brothers mentioned, listening and reading Urdu poetry gives me another dimension and another understanding of what writing and what poetry and what devotional poetry could be like. I also work in the medical field. I'm a doctor. That allows me and it forces me to see life in a particularly reflective manner. I also have kind of interest in various aspects of psychology, specifically human and organizational, the theory of communication, the way that our words, our phrasing, our tonality affects someone ahead of us, the person that we're speaking to. That's all very interesting to me. And I'm sure you'll be glad to know that I'm also interested in poetry, which is what we'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. Um, the poetry journey that I've been on, I'll spend a minute on this. So the very first poem I had ever written was a last minute piece of homework, which was a show and tell piece. It was meant to be written on Greek mythology, and I didn't have anything prepared. So in the morning of the deadline submission, I thought, what can I do in 30 minutes at home without any arts and crafts? So I wrote a piece relating to, I think, one of the narratives on Theseus and the Minotaur. That was the first time I'd written. Poetry then became a sense and a method for me to speak to gatherings that would otherwise have tension in, specifically gatherings linking to interfaith, gatherings linking to, um, I guess, conversations where perhaps there could otherwise be somewhat of, I guess, difficulty in uniting. So thinking not only just interfaith gatherings, but gatherings wherein there are quite controversial topics being spoken about, quite sensitive topics being spoken about, colonialism, be that about certain aspects of history that when we talk about with other people, it can be quite sensitive. So that's when I started getting more into poetry and reciting and performing in public. I then began writing and reciting more in majalis. This was then where I began writing as a kind of a method of storytelling. More recently, as of the last 2 to 3 years, I've been writing a lot more introspective and for pieces that are a lot more introspective. And that's the kind of work that I hope to present to you guys today and talk to you a little bit more about. I think poetry itself is such a powerful medium for more than just storytelling and more than just bringing people together, and definitely more than just conveying a superficial message. And the topic that I want to talk about today, which will be on the next slide, inshallah, is the idea of how we can give depth to our words, how we can use poetry as a form of entertainment, of education, sorry, not just entertainment. Just to cut, let me see what the chat is saying. Poetry helps me to improve my Arabic. Excellent. That's another reason why I think poetry itself as a cultural bridge is a very underutilized tool as well. There's so many things that poetry can do for you and can do for us. So hopefully we can explore a little bit of that today. Brother Muhammad said, the richness of other languages outweighing the limitations of the English language pushes me to not only deepen my relationship with rich languages such as Farsi, Arabic, and Urdu, but drives me to push my poetry in the English language to new heights. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I want to hear a little bit about, actually, I think if we can go back one slide, I think it was in the M2 one before we give away the answer. I think I'd like to just know if you guys have any thoughts about what poetry is to you, meaning what defines poetry. If I have a piece of writing or I recite something right now, what will make it and define it from poetry to simply storytelling to narrating something? You can just kind of put one word answers in the group, or you can unmute your mic and just kind of shout it out. I'm curious to hear because this will help us pinpoint why poetry specifically is useful and what separates it from other mediums of conveying a message. So, what is poetry to you? What makes poetry? I don't want to give the answer away too soon. Brother Willie?
Poetry to me is that powerful lines that it feels like a minefield goes click. You know, you pass by that line and it explodes with the deep meaning that it is very strong. So that's in general what it is to me, like the depth of meaning.
So, the idea of depth of meaning. In the group chat, we've seen Sister Sarah saying a flow of words giving voice to emotions. So the idea of flow and emotions, both quite important. And I'm as well talking about um, emotions or an emotion. If we can go to the next slide, using the different tools of language to add impact to expression. And if we can go to the next slide as well, please. So this is a definition that I personally kind of subscribe to. There's a lot of different definitions you'll find on the internet. And the reason that I particularly like this is that the choice of words they use here. It evokes a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response. And then through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. The main thing that I'm taking from this is that it's a very purposeful, very intentional choice of words, choice of language that evokes an emotion. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And the next one as well, please. Um, I want us to just keep that definition in our head for a moment, and we'll come into the crux of the topic very, very soon. The So we've established what poetry is. We now need to kind of talk about poetry as a source of good or a source of bad. In the Holy Quran in Surah Shu'ara, the verses as follows say, referring to the poets. As for poets, they are followed merely by deviants. Do you not see how they rant in every field, only saying what they never do? Other translations have translated this by saying, do you not see how they kind of wander aimlessly, not doing as they preach? The idea of words without kind of a preceding and a foundational understanding, without practice, can actually cause deviation. It can cause people to leave. It can cause poetry without purpose. Ahsanti. In the next slide, please, we can talk about the actual succeeding verse, the verse that comes immediately after this, again referring to poets. Except those poets who believe, do good, remember Allah often, and poetically avenge the believers after being wrongfully slandered. The wrongdoers will come to know what evil and they will meet. An evil end they will meet. This is a really, really important thing to just spend a moment grasping because poetry itself is not the end goal. Poetry is very much a medium for us to reach something bigger and something greater. When we talk about poetry, we often talk about how to make it sound nice, how to make someone attracted to the words we say, how to make it flow, how to make it rhyme, how to talk in meter. We can sometimes talk with metaphor, symbolism, everything which is very important in its own right and has its own importance. But I want us to kind of remind ourselves and anchor our conversation today onto the end goal, which is that we want it to be a source of us getting closer to God. That's the bottom line. How we get closer to God is by using something like poetry as a way to transform ourselves as individuals and hopefully, if God allows, transform those listening and kind of being a consumer of the poetry that we're writing and reciting. So, if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about what poetry and poetic aspects already exist in Islam, and then we'll talk about some examples about why specifically poetry is what is important, and again, why that in itself is such a powerful medium. So, the concept of dua, firstly, reminding ourselves of this definition that we talked about earlier, that poetry is something that evokes a concentrated, imaginative awareness of an experience or a specific emotional response. when we listen to dua, why is it that we can become tearful? Why is it the fact that we can sometimes become tearful, even just hearing a beautiful recitation without actually understanding or without the words landing yet? Sometimes we can cry because we hear a word or a phrase or a metaphor or a question. That in itself and the way that dua works from a very kind of spiritual lens, that is something to say, but also from the perspective of the poetic nature of it. Dua is not a series of words without a deeper meaning, but also the way that it's crafted together. And if you look at stuff like Dua Kumail, for example, like a dua that almost has a very nice flow and it takes you on a journey throughout it, you will notice that the emotions that you'll feel at different stages of the dua will actually be, you can almost feel it. It's very palpable. As a kind of exercise to do it in your own time at home, next time you're in a mindset which allows you to kind of to explore this, I would encourage you to kind of almost keep like a mental emotional diary as you're listening to a dua, a long one, 20, 30 minutes, and see how you're feeling. There will be times where if you're really in that moment and in that space, you will feel emotional. There'll be times where you'll feel a sense of grandeur, the fact that we're part of something bigger, something special, be that Islam, be that our religion, our faith. There'll be times where you'll feel very vulnerable. There'll be times where you feel scared, fear. And I want you to kind of try to keep that diary and also eventually, over time, try and correlate that with what you're listening to. The reason that that is something that is a useful exercise, not only just for maintaining your self-awareness and your presence when you listen to du'as, but also because in the concept of poetry, you will learn as to what things evoke emotion within you. The concept of du'a, linking back to the slide, is that there's something very poetic about the words we hear and the way that it triggers an emotional response to us. I want to read to you the end of Dua Kamal, towards the end of it, the English translation. It says, "And how can the fire cause him suffering when he hopes for your grace and mercy? And how can its roaring flames char him when you hear his voice and you see his plight? How can he withstand its roaring flames when you know his frailness? And how can he be tossed between its layers when you know his sincerity? And how can the guards of hell threaten him when he calls out to you?" For me, when I listen to this, I hear vulnerability. I the deep kind of emotional reaction we have to the images of the guards of hell threatening us, the roaring flames charring sinners like us. The message is essentially, how can a servant of God who seeks his closeness be punished? That's the message. The message is relatively simple if you strip it all back. But it's not phrased in that way. Imam Ali didn't convey this dua in that way, as a way to just say the message and that's it. He says it in a poetic format, and it hits closer. As sister alluded to on the group chat, it's not something that like you feel the imagery. You don't kind of move past that. And just for the sake of, because I get distracted very easily, please continue to message and post in the group chat, but I'll come to that periodically throughout the talk. The talking about aspects of the Quran. In the Holy Quran, there are specific verses saying that this is not the work of poets. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not a poet. There is a distinction between the Quranic uh, words and phrases from poetry, and that's important to just say as a caveat. When we read the Quran, though, there are ways that we can, and especially reading it alongside tafsir, there are ways that we can be inspired from it and by it and incorporate aspects into our poetry. For anyone here that is observational when it comes to poetry, some very, very common techniques that we hear and we use, including in my poetry, including I'm sure in many of our poetry here, would be the concept of repetition. In the Holy Quran, in Surah Rahman, فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ, for example, there's very which of the favors of your Lord do you deny? Um, there's various other phrases that are kind of repeated throughout. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ referring to indeed in this there are signs of something, or signs for those who reflect, for those who learn, for those who of knowledge. There are repetitions, there are syntax points as well. If you look at a tafsir of I guess any tafsir, you will notice that they comment on the order of which some a concept is introduced in the Holy Quran. So if there's a verse which has A and B, there isn't a mistake, and there isn't a lack of intentionality behind it. There's always a meaning as to why A came first, why B came later. Sometimes in the Holy Quran there is the same kind of word, or the same English word, I should say, but in Arabic there are four different kind of branches of that word. Um, People can be described as nas, insan, bashar, qawm, for example. Each of these words have a more intentional meaning behind it. The reason that I wanted to point this out is that when we write in English, we have, again, not as kind of rich a vocabulary as in other languages, but we still have a choice of words. When we use the words and which words we use and the order we use the words and the order that we introduce emotions and concepts is something that is throughout the whole Quran, throughout all of the du'as we read. It's so heavy. And I feel like if there's anything that we can take in our writing as a way to inspire us to kind of push our writing and to elevate our writing, I think that's something just to think about and to ponder about how we can make our writing more intentional. Something for me that is very, very, I guess, just personally, something that I often look to for inspiration are the whisper prayers of Imam Sajjad, alayhi salam, specifically because of the intimacy and the vulnerability by which he talks, and he talks to God, and he talks from a particular emotion or a particular feeling. And I will touch upon that more as I talk about some of the specific poems that I will talk about and introduce. And I would love to share and hear your thoughts on that in a moment. The next slide, please. So this is going to be the final slide that is a bit theoretical. So just bear with me. I think this is actually one of the most important slides for understanding why this talk is going to be hopefully relevant to any budding writers, poets, and a reminder for me as well as to why sometimes the way we write is so important. Why poetry specifically when it comes to conveying a message? As a lot of you guys had mentioned before regarding the things that make poetry, these are some things. So I'll go through kind of relatively from a kind of a broad lens. Try not to get too bogged down in this stuff so we can get into the actual topic. So poetry specifically has a combination, and this is something that's scientifically proven, that it combines two parts of your brain, the emotional side and the analytical side. The emotional reward side of your brain, the language processing areas of your brain, the sensory imagery side, these are all different aspects of your brain. If you just have a story, it will activate some aspects of your brain, but not others. So your brain is more active when you listen to poetry. And this is proven through scans, through imagery, through MRIs, etc. On to the next point on rhythm and meter. The same parts of your brain that are stimulated with either really heartwarming recitations or musical things, when a sense of flow is reached, these things also activate a kind of a very human response in the body. And that response is essentially one of pleasure. There's something called predictive pleasure, which is quite an interesting concept in poetry. If, that I think I will show you an example of a little later. Why, when we listen to a poem that has a hook, or even if you listen to a recitation, be that Latmiya, be that Aman Qawat, when there's the repeated line, you'll notice that people's emotions generally get more, they have a heightened kind of experience right before the repeated line. It's because of this concept of predictive pleasure. So when people know what's coming next, or they have an understanding of, I know what the next word is because of the rhyming scheme, or because of the way that the poet is guiding me, there's a sense of again, pleasure. Any feeling that is any feeling or any, I wouldn't say feeling, any concept that is linked with a heightened emotion in the body is more memorable. So that's something just to keep in mind. Increased retention, so people remember things more as well with rhythmic conversation and content. Uh, Metaphors. So metaphors also activate a particular part of your brain that make abstract phrases real. If you were to think of silence, let's say, if I was to ask one of you guys to describe silence, let's do that. Tell me a word that you think of when I say silence. Jot in the group. Pin drop. Very nice. Solitude. Absence of voices. Absence of noise. Disarray. Very, very interesting. Wisdom. Darkness. This is so cool because you've all taken a different perspective of what I mean by silence. If I say in a poem the concept of silence, if I mention it, how do I know that my reader is going to be taking it from the perspective of wisdom, which is very, very this way, to disarray, which is very, very leftwards, perhaps? For me, as a writer and a poet, you want to have a somewhat of a grasp of what your audience is feeling. If I was to describe it as the cold silence, for example, not only will you as a reader or a listener take that in a certain direction, but you'll also feel that. You'll feel the solitude, the isolation, the almost uncomfortability of that cold silence. So now I'm guiding you towards a particular way because of my use of imagery or symbolism. And metaphors work the exact same way. Cognitive richness. This for me is something that I feel is part of the depth of poetry and part of what poetry should be all about. If you know there is more behind a word, a phrase, or a sentence, you will spend more time on it. You will interpret it once, maybe even twice. You might then reinterpret it in another way, and then you'll come to a conclusion as to what you're taking from that or what you think the poet, the reciter was trying to convey. Any anything with cognitive richness, any piece of language with cognitive richness allows the reader or almost forces the reader to spend more time with it. Anything that someone spends more time with, they learn more from, they absorb more of. So if there's, let's say, a concept that you want to convey, be that a concept you've learned and you've been thinking about a lot that you picked up from the Holy Quran, for example, or a recent lecture, if you were to write about it in a way that the audience knows that there's richness in this phrase, they will spend more time on it. They will probably get more from it as well. And they might come closer to understanding or to appreciate that concept. They might come closer to where you are, perhaps, in the sense of after experiencing that concept yourself. I hope that makes sense. I appreciate that a lot of this is quite abstract. Um, please do kind of unmute and ask me to explain again if it's not really clear.
Could you perhaps repeat that?
The point of
The
cognitive
cognitive richness, yeah, in particular.
this is quite a it's a quite heavy point, but I think it's quite an important point. So essentially, when you're reciting poetry, you have an engaged audience. When you are reciting poetry and there is either an understanding in your words, meaning you've written something with more time, more effort, and you've chosen your words more carefully,
Hmm.
there's a greater chance that the person that listens to it will, number one, interpret that and I guess perceive that in one way. It will also encourage them to spend more time on that, to actually feel like, have they gotten all the meaning out of this phrase?
Hmm.
That process of interpreting something, reinterpreting it, and ascribing what they think their meaning is to it, that whole process is longer than perhaps me saying something superficially and you
I
taking a
see.
very superficial meaning from that. So that slightly longer, more drawn out process is a way for someone to learn about a concept better, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's essentially just like think about it in retrospect, right? Try to mix
Yeah,
and match the different meanings and interpretations of what the poet is trying to convey.
Yeah, kind of. Exactly that. I think the aspect that having a richness in your language and in your words, it adds an extra layer for people to uncover. And in the process of uncovering that, they might delve into this particular concept more. And that process of delving into that more can be associated and linked with more learning for them. When I cover and talk about the some of the examples, I think that will make a bit more sense if it doesn't already. It allows the listener or reader to pause and reflect on the concept more. I think that's a better way to say it. The human response. So we've talked a little bit about how someone perceives poetry, depending on how you deliver it and how you choose to deliver it. There are certain states that a person or certain responses that you can expect with certain literary techniques. So I'll ask you guys to just think of it. When you hear something with a nice flow, that feels, if you have any pieces of poetry or recitations in your mind, there's a certain level of pleasure that comes with that as well, like a dopamine boost almost. It can create excitement even before the actual content has been delivered. If you hear something in a very hard hitting word, potentially quite an emotional word, that can create emotion before the word and the phrase, sorry, or the sentence is even finished. There, if you think to like Noha's Latmiya, for example, sometimes when people have said two or three words, people are already in tears because in some ways their mind and brain can already guess and assume what's coming next. And that process of thinking as to this person is probably going to talk about this story or this tragedy, that can sometimes be enough to elicit a very human response of sadness, of despair. So that's that's one side, wherein the words you choose and the phrasing that you choose as a poet can elicit a human response. The delivery can also do the same. So if you deliver something in a very kind of staccato, meaning a very broken, very not a very nice flowing way, that can create a little bit of tension before the line has kind of completed. Things like alliteration, things like sibilance. There's techniques that can create a certain feeling in your audience without you needing to spell it out, without having to um, almost creating the foundation of that you want to create for your message to land and to hit better and to hit properly. Nearly finished on this slide. I appreciate this is very heavy, by the way, so do bear with me. Space repetition. When you talk about a concept in poetry, if you want to convey a concept throughout your poem, you have multiple opportunities and avenues to mention something. When you mention something more than once, it's easier to remember. That's the kind of the gist of that point. Memorability, I feel like I've kind of touched upon that. The only thing I would add to that is that memories are structured around a few things: um, emotions, images, sensory cues, and small fragments of information. So any memory you have usually is a combination of these four. Poetry is one of the few art forms that combines all of these. So it combines emotion, imagery, sensory cues, and narrative fragments, essentially small pieces of information or small sentences. So it's innately better and easier for people to memorize and learn. So when we talk about why poetry specifically as a concept for learning, you can think of it as an easier way to learn something and to teach something. And the final thing is kind of what we've all taken from this is that, or from the initial introductions that we had, is that poetry itself has ambiguity. It has obvious meanings and it has hidden meanings, and it allows you to almost fill in the gaps. And that filling in the gaps, the way I see that is it's almost like a scaffolding that you as a poet you create, but there are certain bricks missing, and you allow them those bricks to be missing, and then the audience comes and they place whatever brick they feel fits appropriately in there, and that brick is almost like their interpretation of something, or potentially an emotional relation that they had to a particular sentence, or an emotional feeling that they had, and then they kind of insert that into it and they take it as their own. And that then becomes something that they take and adapt to themselves. Therefore, that poetry almost becomes a part of them. So poetry itself is really powerful. It's really, really, it's got so many different avenues that make it a form to educate people and to educate yourself. I'm just going to spend a second to read the group chat because I feel like I've missed on many, many things. The concept of poetry as an amana, for example, by the way, I'll touch upon that later on. I'm very happy you mentioned that. Open interpretation. It's a very beautiful story of the companion of Sahel. I feel like some of you guys should be doing this workshop. Stuff is beautiful. Doesn't matter if it's spoken or written poetry. I it would matter depending on which aspects you want to convey. So in some ways, cognitive richness is better achieved in written poetry because you have the chance to read it again and reread that sentence and phrase many times over, potentially even refer to books, textbooks, ask people. You haven't got that as much in spoken poetry, but things like rhythm and meter, that those are concepts and techniques that hit harder when you hear them rather than read them. So I would say it matters, and I think it depends on how you want to convey. Is that why there's repetition so the poet can convey what he means? Can be. Repetition itself has loads of different reasons behind it, but that can be a reason for it. It's interesting, certain pieces, just with the initial sentence or tone, can evoke such strong emotion, especially growing up with Marcia and Swords in the Desi community. Mm, very much so. Okay, I think of course so. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, in short, importance of depth. Depth defines poetry. Poetry without depth is a missed opportunity. You're capturing audience or an audience during a very reflective state. So you have an opportunity to make an impact or to introduce a concept. More than all of that as well, the importance of reminding ourselves that poetry is guidance for ourselves, first and foremost. So that's how I want us, those are the things that I want us to have in the forefront of our mind when we talk about the, the next half of the workshop. Okay, next slide, please. And again, kind of talking about what we've already established. Find depth in our poetry, explore methods of how to incorporate depth, and to gain an appreciation for the educative properties of poetry. I'm going to pause for a second. Um, any questions? I think this is a good natural break for discussion before we talk about some examples of where these concepts can be seen. Oh no, just Lauren.
I had a quick question. I think you mentioned something about how people may have different um of the poetry or the words that you are reciting or have written. So how does one make sure that people don't take the wrong interpretation, I suppose? Because naturally everyone will have like a different imagination reading your words, right?
Mhm. So how do we make sure that people haven't taken the wrong interpretation from our writing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Because, for example, if you're saying, I'm just using another example of what you said, actually, you said cold, like a cold,
Right.
sorry, just remind me again, what did you say about cold? Or like,
Was it?
like, for example, a cold night, right? It could be interpreted as loneliness, and, just generally it could basically be imagined as something dark, right?
Mhm.
I.e. something that is a negative emotion. But then it can also be described as something positive, right?
Mm.
Because it can have a positive interpretation to it.
Completely, completely. So I think two things. Number one is if there's something, if there's an interpretation that is different but not wrong, I think that's okay because I guess that's one of the aspects of the beauties of poetry. If it's something which can lead someone's mind and journey almost away from away from the point that you're trying to convey, I think that comes from, I guess, somewhat the skill of how you portray the message. So, for example, if the tone of the sentence and the preceding sentence is very somber and dark, then the words will almost fit into the correct meaning and the correct box. Meaning, if there's a interpretation of this word that could be positive and negative, you will naturally gravitate towards the negative one because of the fact that um, you've kind of led the audience towards that emotion. I think the words you choose and the importance of intentionality in this is really key. So if you choose the right words and the right adjectives and the right metaphors, then you should usually get across the message you want to. This is one of the best, like the best, or this is a very strong argument as to why sharing your poetry with other people is useful, because it's something that, and this has actually happened on the Poets of the Household group a couple times, I think, which little shout out to join the group if you guys are writing and budding poets. Brother Nucky can kind of give advice on how to do that if anyone's interested. But there have been times where someone's shared something and kind of asked the audience, what did you take from this? And then sometimes people have taken something that has been completely in line with what the poets wanted. But sometimes on occasion it's been someone has said, oh, this is actually, I didn't understand this, or this didn't have clarity. And that's why, again, feedback is also really important with that. Does that answer your question, Serena?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think I mainly asked this because, for example, sometimes when I'm reading Urdu poetry, for example, I think that there's like a in like a plain interpretation of it, but then there's like how you also mentioned like with the cognitive richness, etc. There's like a more in-depth version of it, which can kind of be interpreted slightly differently than what it just means on paper. I think that's why I asked you that question. But that's a good idea, like taking feedback from like other people, to see how obviously it comes across, and what message you are portraying through your words.
One thing I would also add to that, by the way, is especially with if you're talking about the top level poets from Urdu or even English, wherever you look, one thing that comforts me is never feel frustrated if you don't feel like you've achieved the full meaning of a poem. Um, I think one of the, I think Sister Sarah, yeah, Sister Mariam, sorry, mentioned that the the best poetry or the best poems are indeed universal, and the readers are given free rein to interpret it, but also they're allowed to kind of interpret it to as far as they want or as superficial level as they want. And ideally, in my head, the best poems are the ones that make sense in both light. Like you can spend a lot of time with it. You can almost unpack the cognitive richness that we spoke about, or you can actually take it at surface value and you could still take something from it. In my head, those are the poems that I want to create, wherein every aspect, wherever you're coming from, and with whatever you want to take from the poem, you can take something from it, depending on the level that you want to take and your capacity almost. Um, Brother Muhammad, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to go about kind of like inquire about like the whole process of like beginning to write a piece because you mentioned like the aspects of depth. And when it comes to me personally, I feel like there's a little bit of a clash when it comes to adding structure to your writing in a way that's kind of productive and trying to write it from a place that's deep. Trying not to produce an artificial feeling, but to make it real,
Mm,
make it land. Because like ultimately as a poet, you're not really focusing more on the audience than you are to just convey the words that are kind of
mm,
like jumbled up within your own heart. So I just want to inquire about like what's your process like? How do you ground yourself when you're starting out to write a piece? Or like you're thinking that, okay, I need to have like at least these many pieces lined up for, let's say, a Fatimiyya or like a certain event that's coming up.
So just so I can understand your question, is it a case of if, let's say I have a topic, let's say Fatimiyya, how would I go about trying to create a piece that has these educative properties and people can learn from? How do I kind of craft it from there? Is that your thing? Your
Something, yeah, something along those lines, and more so to deal with like understanding that it comes from a sense of vulnerability, right? The whole like concept of like you starting out to write a piece comes from a sense of vulnerability. And I feel like there could be a point where if you try to start writing out a piece and you've not really considered that aspect and you just want it to be structured in a way that you can actually have something that's like
mm,
usable and actually readable,
mm,
then I feel like that's kind of pushed to the side. Like, how do you manage
mm.
like those
So
components?
really good question. Really, really good question. I would say that what helps me is once you once you see the literary stuff, meaning structure, metaphors, similes, sibilants, alliteration, all these techniques, once you see them as tools that are at your disposal and you understand how they link and how they can evoke emotion, then almost you don't even think about how to use structure and how to kind of all these other things. You don't really think about how they can, you don't even think about how to incorporate them. Your goal is almost to explore the vulnerability that you've talked about in the topic that you're choosing to explore, and then everything else kind of comes in because you pull them as and when you need them. So if you, let's say, have the topic of Fatimiyya and you want to write a piece which will be vulnerable, but you want to write it in a way that tells more than just your vulnerability to yourself, but it also shares something that other people can gain from, and you're also like well equipped with these other tools around you, then I find that those like the end goal, which is again having this piece which is almost a piece of your heart, it's a piece of your brain, your mind. Once you get that onto paper, it's almost so well packaged that other people can take from it as well. And when I say well packaged, I mean to say because you've used all these other tools at your disposal, you've used the skills that you have as a writer. So then when someone else sees it and someone else recognizes that they can see the vulnerability, but it's not just vulnerability that is just vulnerability and that's it. It's vulnerability that is packaged well.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like basically like these devices, you use them enough to the point where they don't act as constraints to your poetry, but rather as means for it to grow. And eventually, when you use them enough, it just becomes second nature for you. And then you can
Exactly,
explore both your vulnerability alongside meaningful. Okay, interesting.
exactly that. Like in the sense that the vulnerability is, I think you need to put all your emphasis on that because if you don't, then you are in this position where you're trying to incorporate these techniques and you're spending so long on the theoretical side that you're missing the kind of the meaning, which is actually what drives a poem and what actually gives a poem depth, right? Um, but that process, in order to have that process, that does come with some training from that side of trying to incorporate something and spending some time understanding how does this particular technique evoke the emotion I want it to evoke, or even listening to a piece and thinking, I felt really emotional during this line. Why did I feel emotional in this line? Oh, he used this particular phrase or this technique, or she presented it in this way. So being really observational of pieces that you listen to and you kind of absorb. I think that's the takeaway I'd give. I'd give. And let me just read the comment. I once used a sentence to describe the city of love I roam. That's very interesting. The city of love I roam. Like the what someone took from that. Um, one verse might hit your heart different today. A week from now, it might hit your heart different. Okay, I'll come to the remainder of the comments in a moment because I think it might be worth us having like a 2 to 3 minute break just to stretch our legs. Can we go to the next slide, please, Nakiba? Yes. Okay. So the remainder of the talk is going to be all using examples. Um, it sounds very biased, but I think this is the part of the talk that I was most excited for. The previous, I think, is important for us to understand, so we can try to appreciate why this whole conversation is important. But I think now you're going to see it hopefully in practice to some extent. So can we say right now is for me it's 7:04. I think it's 2:04 for you guys in Canada. Should we say around 2:10? Is that fair? 5 minutes? Okay. Inshallah, we'll come back in around 5 minutes. Grab a glass of water. Grab a. I don't think you need a pen and paper, but just stretch your legs a little. And I'll read through the comments in the meantime. Can I ask something after there? For some reason, my speakers are really causing problems. Can I join from my phone and I'll turn off the audio from my laptop? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, I can't rejoin the meeting because I was removed by the host.
Oh, that was when you were, I think that's when we all heard the echo because I think both things joined. So why don't you join right now? I'll mute your computer and then request to join again.
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool, awesome. Just for everyone's awareness, I switched over to another device just so I can hear better. Apologies if I didn't answer any of your questions really precisely with what you were looking for, just because I was hearing every third word or second word. So inshallah, at the end of today, after around maybe 40 minutes or so, I hope that we'll wrap things up in around 45 minutes, and we'll have kind of a dedicated 10 or so minutes to have any questions. So if there is anything that perhaps you would like to kind of ask again, or perhaps in a bit more detail, I think that would be a good time to do so. Okay. So can I just get a few thumbs up? Is everyone back? Got 2, 3, 4. Good. Okay, awesome. Cool. All right. So I've got 5-ish examples. These are poems that I've written over the past few years. These are by far not the best poems in the world to analyze these things from. But because I've written them, I have somewhat of an understanding that I can share on them. And I guess the unique perspective of knowing what the writer was meant to convey and what they actually conveyed and what you as an audience perceived from them, I think it could lead to quite a interesting discussion. So, with Nakibai's permission, if we can go to the next slide, I will read a bit of this piece. These are all small passages and excerpts from the full poems, and then basically we'll talk a little bit about a couple sentences that I want us to focus on. This one in particular is called A Flag Bearer's Calluses, referring to, this is for an event where we were meant to be talking about the flag bearers of Islam. So many people talked about Hazrat Abbas, Imam Ali, Bibi Zainab, etc. I tried to take it from the perspective of seeing ourselves, Muslims, as the flag bearers. And callous is referring to kind of the hardened hands that held these flags, or held this flag of Islam. So I will read this passage, and I think there's some more in the next slide. I want you guys to just think about specifically looking at any structure or syllabic balance, meaning like the use of syllables. Okay, but anything you take from it, I'd be interested to know, and then we'll have a discussion. So the poem starts by saying, "For I hold a flag so grand, the finest patterned intricate fabric, with every stitch in harmony with the next, borders defined clear, cloth designed strong, every aspect of its arrangement absolutely immaculate. A flag with dimensions vast, enough to capture a slave and a master under a single shadow, a shadow to cover all colours and a shadow to exceed all shades. For no man or woman shall not belong underneath the canopy of this cloth. Through its shade, it would protect those from beyond, and through its colours, design would leave onlookers fond. A flag, raised first 1400 years before by a man whose hand's outline still etched upon this pole, accentuated for every bearer since chooses to hold this pole like he, passed down along a chain of lovers and devotees, declaring definitively that this flag shall not drop in certainty. With no indecision, they hold it with such grace as it passes through generation after holy generation, with lions having held this flag, stern-faced and brave, and leaders of the battlefield stating their ownership. They would glide below a flag gliding smooth, fluttering in the wind, but affixed in nature. Amidst winds and tribulations, the flag would never shake. As if a thread tethered this flag to the heavens. Now my hand on this flag is what connects me to the skies, and the thread that descends from above me anchors my bones to a God that loves me. Though I feel the wind keeping the flag afloat as if by God's breath itself, with this bearer only bringing bounties to their own soul, For the flag will fly, even if no one were to be holding this pole. He promises, through rocky roads and treacherous rows, his flag will be guarded, not by the bearer, but by the weaver himself. My arm, my strength, merely a show meant I can say I've held the flag of faith for merely a moment. And I'll pause there. So this is the beginning of this piece. This piece goes on to talk a little bit more about the flag of Islam, who had carried it, and talking a little bit about other examples in history. I want to pause for a second. If there's any initial thoughts, you don't have to have initial thoughts, but I'll be keen to hear if anyone does. 5-10 seconds, we'll spend a bit of time, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
With your permission, if I may.
The fact that it's one stanza reads like one long line of thought, was that intentional? So it's a good question. I think there's two things I would just mention, by the way. This is initially a spoken word piece, so because of that, you might notice some punctuation stuff wasn't intentional. So I definitely would have added a few commas and full stops and whatnot. But in terms of the train of thought, especially with these kind of pieces that I feel like are quite introspective, and it can allow you to think, it can allow you to guide your audience along your line of thinking. I like to build momentum at the beginning of my pieces. So essentially what I'm trying to get across is we are holding this flag of Islam, and what actually is this flag? That's what I'm trying to convey. So throughout the beginning, because I want to really hammer down and I want them to understand what this flag is, that's kind of why I'm kind of going point, and image, and I'm trying to kind of build momentum along that line. So I would say that concept was intentional, the idea of trying to kind of build momentum. Sorry, did someone else say something? Did I interrupt you?
Yeah, I just noticed that like I believe in the previous slide, or I think it is in the slide, yes. Um that moment where you mentioned it almost at least felt to me like the audience, as if it was evoking some type of interaction with the piece itself. It's like
Interesting.
the person like was kind of like, so you started off with like this description of the flag itself and how it kind of interwoved and how it passed through, and now it reached a point where now the person who's sitting amongst the audience is envisioning himself to be the person in the poem. He's kind of considering himself to be a part of the poem. He's interacting with the poem, at least mentally. That's what was going through my mind when that he just paused, that silence I evoked. It's like there was like this deep feeling of like I need to. There seemed like a semblance to my being within this poem. And like other than that, there's this one part on the second slide where you mentioned the attribute of above me and loves me. I really love that because like how you combine both the attribute of grandeur with compassion within just two lines and delivered it so well. This blew me away. It's amazing.
I really appreciate your words. Very kind. That particular sentence, or that particular separation, is not separation. That particular couplet, sorry, is something that I will touch upon, because I think there's something there that I think that the separation between compassion and like grandeur is a really, really beautiful comment to make. There's also something about that couplet which I'll touch upon, which I think separates it from the others and it makes it stand out a little bit more. If we can go to the first slide, there's a couple in each of these excerpts. I just want to talk about one or two things. I won't go through the whole thing because that will probably bore us all. But there's some stuff that I want to touch upon, and the reason behind this, by the way, is not, and please, I hope you guys see this way, but it's definitely not for me to just say this is the technique, look how cool it is. I want you to firstly hopefully recognize what technique it is with the intention of seeing, okay, I didn't actually know we can do this with writing. For example, if there's a particular style that you haven't heard before, or there's a particular way that I've tried to incorporate something, this is just a way to increase our artillery almost of poetic techniques and styles, and trying to take some stylistic stuff that I might have included in this poem. It's definitely not for the sake of loving to analyze my own work, I promise you. It's, if anything, it's the opposite, but I've got to power through that. So kind of a few things from this this first on this slide. So when I talk about the flag, notice that I spend a little bit of time talking about the flags and the attributes of the flag. So I mentioned that every stitch in harmony with the next, meaning there are no incongruencies in Islam. There's no stitch that is essentially out of place. It's perfect. I talk about the dimensions of this flag being vast and covering all colors, shades, a slave and a master. The rulings and the jurisprudence for both a slave and a master is covered in Islam. The rights of a master to a slave and the rights of a slave to its master. Man, woman, all shades. I try to kind of give this feeling of Islam being all-encompassing, which it is. I then talk about something which I talk about essentially the sunnah of the Prophet. A man whose hands outline still etched up on this pole. What I wanted you as a audience, what I wanted the audience to take from this is that these hands outlined on this pole is because the Holy Prophet not only was holding this pole so firmly, and he was such a representative of Islam, the representative of Islam, but every bearer since wants to hold the pole, i.e. practice Islam like he did. I.e. this outline, this etching is almost accentuated because every person afterwards holds the pole like he. The next slide, I wanted to, throughout this piece, which obviously we haven't got the chance to go through the whole thing, but I wanted to allude to the other flag bearers, because we are flag bearers of Islam. Like that's a given. Like we are in our workplace, in our schools, and our universities. But I didn't want to neglect the fact that, or neglect the acknowledgement of the people that really held the flag of Islam in a way that we want to hold it. So I tried to incorporate it subtly. So some people might have noticed, with lions having held this flag. Does anything come to mind?
Because the only personalities that come to mind are like Amir al-Mu'minin, or the Aimma, or like even those who were in support of those individuals and worked tirelessly to ensure justice.
Excellent. Perfect. So with lions having held this flag, I wanted to allude, so stern-faced, for those that are kind of have a better grasp of the Arabic language than perhaps I do, a stern-faced lion is the definition of Abbas. A brave lion is the definition of Haydar, meaning Imam Ali. So not only the more generic, that if someone doesn't actually understand or doesn't know about the connection between those, it still hopefully makes sense with the fact that, like you said, there are individuals in our history that are such forces that, and such brave individuals, that when we say lions having held this flag, it makes sense. Stern-faced and brave, people might not really read into that line too much. They might just assume that's referring to the lions of our faith, of which, alhamdulillah, we have, there's plenty of them. But again, if you know that reference, then it's something that can hopefully add another dimension, and you can potentially think of it from the perspective that, okay, he's trying to allude to the flag bearers in Islam. Let me see throughout the poem and the piece which other ones I can pick up, right? This is a cognitive richness that I'm trying to kind of instill in the piece. And again, throughout the whole piece, it almost in some ways turns it into a little bit, kind of gamifies it, where if you're listening to it, you kind of try to use your knowledge, what you've learned in lectures and spaces, to see what you can pick up and what you can take from it. And in that process of trying to do that, again, you're spending more time with the piece, you're reading more into sentences and lines. I talk about the flag of Islam fluttering in the wind, meaning being adaptable, being active, being proactive, but being affixed in nature, because the morality in Islam is something that doesn't change with times. This is the line that I think the brother you touched upon, and I'm very happy you touched upon it, because there is something separate about this line. I say, as if a thread tethered this flag to the heavens, now my hand on this flag is what connects me to the skies, thinking literally from skies, tethered, tethered thread, flag, my hand on the pole. The thread that descends from above me anchors my bones to a God that loves me. Not only is there the separation between the compassion and the grandeur, but this is also the first line that has actually a perfect rhyme. And syllabistically, it's the first one that sounds good on the ear, I would say. The rest of it flows somewhat, but there isn't a line that is a very clear AA or AB rhyming pattern. So this one is the first one that actually sits nicely in our ears and in our brain and our mind. So that very, if there is a poem and a piece wherein there's a lot of inconsistencies and irregularities, and suddenly there's a line that's regular and it's almost proper, if you want to take it that way, that creates a distinction between the rest of the piece. That distinction then makes that line more powerful. So not only does it give me a good chance to take a break, take a pause, but it also allows the reader to feel that line more, if that makes sense. Which I'm happy that you actually picked up, because that was what the intention of that change of syllables was. One other thing later on in the piece that I cover, I say towards the end of the piece, the excerpt, for the flag will fly even if no one were to be holding this pole. He promises through rocky roads and treacherous roads. In Surah Hijr, which translates to rocky roads, God promises, indeed, again paraphrased, indeed, we have sent the Quran and we will protect it. So again, if you don't know the reference, you will understand this by saying, the flag will fly, even if it goes through difficult times and obstacles. God will protect it, his flag will be guarded. But if you know the reference, suddenly you're thinking, okay, so he literally promises this through rocky roads, meaning Surah Hijr. This is, again, a way that I'm trying to incorporate stuff that I've learned, and I'm trying to, or in some way, solidify in my writing and my delivery for an audience that can hopefully, potentially, pick up some aspects of it. Brother Muhammad, please.
Yeah, in this regard, I wanted to ask, like, what are the limitations, or like how far can you reach in terms, because there was a certain time where I focused on a certain narration that I built up a entire piece on, and I deliberately went out of my way to actually narrate the narration itself and then begin my piece in order to kind of like at least frame or at least give direction to, not only like give understanding to it because it's talking about a very particular event, but also try to give direction in that sense. So what like are the bounds of like how far you can reach with something like you mentioned, like rocky roads, and like one could imagine this to be the, like, if like look, personally I did not know this reference. I could imagine it to be the path going towards truth and righteousness, and upon this, the ones who hold the flag are going through tribulations, and therefore they will go through rocky roads and treacherous roads of enemies and wars and etc. So I just want to understand, like, what are the bounds of it, and should there be a point where you should be looking towards, like, you know what, I feel that this particular narration is like really good, so I should be going forward to kind of like declare it.
I love this question, because this is something that I think throughout, this is like a big dilemma that I think a lot of poets would have. How much do we spell it out versus how much do we leave it there and see what people take from it? Brother Naqvi said show versus tell. Sometimes instead of spelling it out for the reader, listener, you need to use your craft in a way where you don't have to explain yourself. I think that's the best explanation. I would say sometimes, and this is, by the way, my parents always say to me, like, Rameez, like, why are you not spelling this out? Because I want to understand it, but because you don't spell it out, I've lost an element or a layer of interpretation. The response that I always give would be, number one, some novelty is beautiful in itself, right? If you read this piece without knowing that particular reference, the interpretation you just had, by the way, was absolutely beautiful. Like, it completely works. There's nothing about that doesn't. You've given that piece of the poem an extra level of life almost, which is amazing. If you know that, you can also add on an extra level of interpretation, and potentially the second time you read it or you hear it, you might have read this verse, or potentially someone might have spoken to you about it, or I might have mentioned it to a friend. And then it means the next time you read it, you get more from it, and you get more from it. And for me, that giving your poem and your poetry that level of just personality, I think that's kind of what entices me to not spell out. If it's something that I feel, if you don't know it, you will actually lose the whole poem and the concept of the poem. Then usually in my introduction, I will say it. I will probably kind of let the audience know that this is one of the references that I kind of allude to. But I'm definitely on the side of Naqvi by when the trying to keep it up to the audience to take what they want from it. That's where I work on. That's where I work from predominantly. You will see a lot of that coming up, by the way, because there's a lot of stuff that people like. I'm not expecting people to know or take from it, and I don't really. That's not why I'm writing it. Partly because I want to solidify it in my head and as a learning for myself, but also partly because if you do and you do recognize it, you will try to unpack more of the poem and you'll spend more time delving into it, which is probably one of the biggest honors that a poet could have. I hope that answered the question. If
Yeah, I gave a lot of clarity, honestly. Thank you for that.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And let's do the next example. This is a shorter one. So this is on a piece called "They Were Protected by His Word," referring to the people. It was on, I think, the Holy Prophet's. I think the Milad of the Holy Prophet, or the Mawlid of the Holy Prophet. And in this, I want to talk a bit about wordplay. Not wordplay just for the fact of sounding cool and fun, like fun, entertaining, but for the fact that it could convey meaning in and of itself. So next slide, please. So the Holy Prophet quotes this bit. "For my Lord has commanded justice. He speaks not from his own accord. For my Lord has commanded justice, yet the people could not perceive this, just that salvation could not be just his. So for years he would mold and mend the minds of man so they could understand justice." Pausing for a second. So, wordplay, even if you don't fully follow it, you probably would have, your ears would hear the same sounds. Just, his, this, that, like these kind of words that almost sound the same. They're not the same, but they sound similar and the same. Perceive this. There's a lot of these kind of sounds. What I wanted to convey by this, and not even wanted to convey by this, but what I was hoping that an audience could take. I can ask actually. What does the audience take from this? Was there anything in particular that stood out? And don't at all feel like there was something that you have to have taken from this, and if you didn't, you didn't read into it properly. But I'm just curious.
I'm just curious before I answer it. Are
Mm.
the quotation marks like, is it like portraying like a reference to something? Because I definitely understood it as a reference.
So this was like when
Okay,
this
so
was a hadith from the Holy Prophet where he said, "My Lord has commanded justice." And actually, before this, I had led into the reference where it made a bit more sense, but I've obviously cut that out just because of the focus on the wordplay. But yeah, it is a reference.
It's interesting because the way that I took it is I observed this more so in the context of Imam Ali with the Khawarij.
Mm.
That during
Mm.
the time that they did not understand his position and therefore they considered him to be with falsehood. Therefore,
Mm.
the statement, "For my Lord has commanded justice," it seems as though this is the rebuttal, or this kind of sums up the rebuttal of Imam Ali alayhi salam.
Mm.
Right, going forward with his mission and standing with the truth kind of portrays that, and then the following lines kind of saying that just that salvation could not be just his, kind of portrays
Mm.
how even though he did not have the reins of the government, he was actively trying to save as many people as he could. So yeah.
That's it. That's beautiful. That's so these kind of things are phenomenal. When you take an excerpt, it obviously takes away from the context. This was in the context of a whole piece wherein I talked about the Holy Prophet. So that would probably not have come to your mind as quickly if it was in the context of the Holy Prophet and the flow was clearly kind of telling the story of the Holy Prophet. This particularly, by the way, is from Surah Al-Araf, I think, wherein the Holy Prophet says this, "For my Lord has commanded justice." So it's from that line. But again, if there was a flow, I think similar to what Sister Anna had said earlier, like how do you keep the references in line with what you want to convey? I think it probably would have done a better job with that, with the context. But in all honesty, having listened to the piece, you've reconsolidated something that you've been aware of, and you're like from your reading, from your like your learning. That in itself is awesome, which is very cool. Thank you for sharing, by the way. That's a new element to this that I didn't even think of. I want to talk a little bit about the wordplay, if that's okay with you guys. So what I wanted to convey from this is wordplay can. So okay, let me reframe it. So with this, I'm talking about my Lord has commanded justice, is what the Holy Prophet said, meaning the end goal is justice. We want to achieve that. In the piece that I kind of build up, I talk about the fact that men and the ummah at that time, if you can call it that, was completely divided, and they were essentially lacking basic morality. So I want to convey the point and the idea that justice was not found anywhere in that time, and it was only through the Holy Prophet molding and mending the minds of man that justice could be created and could be formed. So I tried to essentially bastardize the word justice and split it up and make your mind think of that word without actually saying the word, because that's essentially what it was like at the time. There wasn't, the concept of justice existed in people's minds, but people wouldn't be able to actually experience it because it didn't exist. So I wanted to say that people could not perceive this, just that justice, just that salvation could not be just his. So for years he would mold and mend the minds of man so they could understand, and then I present justice as a full entity. This, if you're listening to, may not make much sense, but what will definitely make sense is that when I finish off by saying they could understand justice, that phrase is the only bit that actually sits comfortably in your head, because the rest of it is quite confusing. People could not perceive this, just that salvation could not be just his. People might be lost in that train of thought, which is okay, which is fine, because the main thing is that I want to convey is the end, so they can understand justice. I hope that makes sense. That was kind of the way that I tried to use wordplay to reflect how messed up man's mind was, and then how he essentially molded it, fixed it, and then presented us with a solution. Let's go to the next example. So this is a piece which I had written in the concept of God's justice. It was. This is something which is very, very, very much a personal thing. I would not expect anyone to take these kind of concepts from listening to the piece, listen to the poem. But this is why I had incorporated it, because I wanted to, this just as a bit of context. When I was writing these pieces, I started to understand that God's justice is such a thing that you can't do justice to in terms of acknowledging and representing in a piece, especially a piece that is so flawed, in the sense that God's justice you can take from the Holy Quran, you can take from Hadith, which are more pure methods of conveying. Me trying to, sure, sounds good. We'll do one or two examples and then we'll wrap up. Me trying to convey these thoughts through my very flawed words and language is impossible. So if you can go to the next slide. I start the piece by saying this. When I look to imagine your greatness, I tire. Not lost at understanding 98 or 99, but with the fact that you begin these lines of mine, lost in the thought of how my thoughts you align, and how oceans so vast would dry in writing the signs of the divine. For I tire soon, soon before blessing this broken being belonging to you, for the one who knows the isms I hold wretched, and created me by name before I entered into creation. For I know I begin in your name, but what inexact words can be preceded by you, O Allah? I go on. The reason that I incorporated this as a beginning was not only just because of the fact that Allah's justice is difficult to fathom and difficult to write about, but also I recognize this, that every time I start a piece, I would start with Bismillah, and then I would proceed by kind of giving my interpretation, which is essentially, there's nothing wrong with that in itself, as long as the interpretation is grounded well in Islamic thought and isn't kind of crazy. But it was just a concept in my head that I was playing with. So, any comments or thoughts when you hear this or when you listen to this? Okay, the flow is something that it flows better here than in the previous ones. That's a good recognition. And I think one big thing to mention as well, actually, I'm trying to give like this kind of lazy tiredness to it, where I'm trying to make you feel the tiredness that I'm experiencing. So I mentioned I tire, not lost to understanding 98 or 99, but it's the thought, the fact that you begin these lines of mine. It's almost like nursery rhyme-esque. So that's a really good point. What else can you guys see, if anything?
Yeah, I feel like the point that you hinted about exhaustion, and that initial exhaustion kind of leads into this acceptance that there's like almost like a seemingly divine inspiration of sorts to like the initiation of this entire process. Like you mentioned, like, but with the fact that you begin these lines of mine, kind of like decoding how your own like process of poetry kind of like begins. Like you start out by writing words that kind of align your thoughts, but because you're trying to understand godly concepts and you're grounded within your aqaid, basically, these thoughts are kind of like placed in your mind, and like they're kind of like echoing in a way concepts, or like basically uh, I'm putting it in the most efficient way, but what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kind of has kind of chose for you to say, you know.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I like that. I quite like that. I didn't. That's a new interpretation that I'm going to take in my head, because I like that. I wouldn't add anything to that. And one of the sisters mentioned the idea that the longer lines also gives this idea of longing something out and dragging something, and I think that feeling is what I was trying to convey, and the observations you guys have made have kind of added to that, because like the end goal is in my head is that exhaustion, that tiredness. Both your interpretations of that are completely valid. There's one thing that I tried to do here, wherein, so in the final three lines of this stanza, or this except, I wanted to at some point in the piece talk about the fact that essentially what I said here, what inexact words can be preceded by you, O Allah. I had actually initially thought of writing those three lines, soon before blessing this broken being belonging to you, da, 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 da. What inexact words can be preceded by you? But anyway, Bismillah. That's kind of one thought I had in my head. But then I kind of thought, number one, there's an element of the magic that's lost because I'm spelling out. And I'm saying, what inexact words can be preceded by you, but this is how I'm going to do it. This is what I'm going to do by starting in your name, which is what we always do and what we kind of try to do. So I didn't want to try to make it too obvious. So how can I get that message across without making it obvious? I did the following. So in the third line prior to the ending, I incorporate this alliteration, which again the sister mentioned in the comments. Before blessing broken being belonging. Okay, so the ba sound. The next line, I talk about the isms, meaning liberalism, modernism, isms that exist inside of us, consumerism, that are ultimately ungodly. But also for those where ismi, that's like Arabic overlap, created me by name. So ism, name, I've got that concept in that line. And then in the final one, begin in your name, preceded by you, O Allah. So I've tried to have the burst sound, the ism, Allah, for example. So if you were to, in my head, again, no one takes that. No one will absorb that. That's absolutely fine, because I didn't write this for anyone else's absorption. This is for me to kind of take, and almost a way for me to use my creativity to try to incorporate a message I wanted to incorporate to myself. So that's one thing that, again, a creative way to do it. I think we may have time for one more example. Can we do the next slide? Let me see which slide we should do, actually. I will ask you guys, actually. Okay. I'll do. We'll do this one very quickly, and then we'll do the final one. I think the final one is the one that I actually want to. I'm a bit more excited about. So this is talking about a piece which is written as a Messiah. So specifically linked to a writing about Hazrat Ali Akbar in the Battle of Karbala, and how Imam Hussein, in various of the Maqatil, he said that to Hazrat Ali Akbar, like, don't rush out to battle, because obviously that means that you'll rush out to your death. Go slowly. So this whole piece was written with the hook, "Oh Akbar, go slowly, go slowly." And I just want to touch on how to weave references here. And this is the idea of how to incorporate learning into a piece without making it very obvious. So without making it very clunky. It's obvious, but not clunky. If you can do the next slide, please. I would, if we had time, I would make this an exercise, but I don't think we do at the moment. So I'm going to just read a bit of this, starting from the middle area. So the learning is, I read the Maqtal Hazrat Akbar from various books, and they all had these three things that were consistent themes. One of which Hazrat Akbar left, and he said, this is how he introduced himself to the enemies. I am Ali, son of Al-Hussein, son of Ali. He later then recited the Quranic verse, saying that Allah surely chose Adam, Nuh, and the family of Ibrahim and the family of Imran over all people, referring to his lineage, which is the family of Ibrahim. So again, essentially saying, Allah has chosen these people, I am of these people, you guys are not, recognizing and establishing the I guess the importance that his family held. And then later on, there's some narrations that say that when Imam Hussein saw the spear in Hazrat Ali Akbar's chest, he looked to Najaf and said, I have come to my Khaybar, father. So reading from the beginning, reading from the middle, sorry, he says, for the first time you rode out, O Akbar, you said, I am Ali, and by God, Ali you became. For our lives they may take, but being from Ibrahim they can't claim. Though the strength of Ali's sons will again soon be tested, as I see you leave to the battlefield, parched, unrested, with a heart so full. They will surely take that as their aim, for then Khaybar's strength will not go by untested for you and I both. For your father will soon see a spear between your ribs nested, but I have weakened during these days, O Akbar, so I won't have strength to remove it out wholly. So give me time, my son, go slowly, go slowly. And that hook is one that's used throughout the piece. The main thing I wanted to show in this is one can read something, read a story, read a narration, and you can then try to incorporate it into your pieces in various. You can almost extend the narration. So, for example, the narration very obviously said, "I am Ali," referring to himself, but I've tried to extend that to refer to when he said, "I am Ali." He actually morphed into Imam Ali, that kind of concept, that kind of language. I think we might be short of time. I don't want to keep you guys beyond the time that we promised. So I think what's next?
I think you could go for the next one if you want to.
Naqvi, do I have permission? We'll be around 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think we could do 5 minutes for the question, and if you want to do the next slide, that's fine.
Okay, we'll do the next slide, because this is something that I think, this is something that I think is quite interesting to look into, and then we'll conclude. And this is one of probably my favorite pieces I've written. The full piece is on my Instagram if anyone is interested. The in this particular piece, in this particular excerpt, what I want to kind of get across is the difference between direct references and weaved references. And there's a particular excerpt that has both. So I think it's useful to talk about. Brother Muhammad earlier, we also spoke about the idea of when to make something really explicit and when not to. So in this, I think you could hopefully see some sort of separation between the two. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the piece, this is from like the middle of the piece. It says, also to mention, this whole piece is written regarding how the nighttime, the darkness, solitude is the only thing that actually knew Imam Ali, because so many of his good deeds were done in that kind of space. It says, the nights would long for Ali's company. The night silence, a cloak under which Ali would remember the soft clicking of beads outlasting the fire's final ember. Under dimmed candlelight, he'd seek nearness to his Lord, worshipping him not from fear nor craving reward, elevating his own status to one so adored by us, by Muhammad, and by his Lord. When he would address, O people who believe, Ali was included. When he would purify the household and purity they'd receive, Ali was included. When he stated the religion was perfected and perfect to perceive, Ali was included. When he described the best of all beings, to Ali and his followers he alluded, his status stemming from these nights of worship, sitting so secluded. It's in clear evidence. Piece goes on. So over here, we may be familiar with this, by the way, so this might be a more obvious narration, a more obvious reference. The reason I call it a weaved reference is because if you don't understand it, the concept, you can understand it from this piece of poetry, saying that worshipping him not from fear nor craving reward, elevating his own status to one so adored. This is based on hadith where Imam Ali had talked about worshipping God not from fear nor for the rewards of heaven, but worshipping him because he's worthy of worship. However, if you weren't aware of that hadith, for example, then the concept the hadith is trying to portray, you can still get from this piece if that makes sense when you hear it. However, later on, very obviously, I'm spelling out where the references are. When he would address, or people who believe, when he would purify, when he stated. So these are kind of obvious links to a verse in the Holy Quran. Later on, then, this is again something that for me is, there's some references that I think are very meaningful. There's some references that I include more so as almost as a way to, like, if you know kind of thing. But there's nothing heavy about them particularly, but I feel like incorporating that sometimes adds another chance for someone to consolidate some knowledge or something they've learnt. So when I end by saying he described all beings, to Ali and his followers he alluded, his status stemming from the nights of worship sitting so secluded. The three lines before that are quite well-known Quranic verses. Obviously, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu is like a phrase generally used, but then referring to two very well-known verses, Surah Ahzab and Surah Ma'idah, I believe. But the final one is a little bit less well-known in the concept of referring to Imam Ali. This is particularly in Surah Bayyinah. And in my head, I did know that there is a separation between the well-known references and the less well-known. So Bayyinah means clear evidence. So for those that perhaps might not be familiar with where it's from, I've kind of told you, because I've said it's in clear evidence. I've spelt out. Again, this is a kind of a fun reference as opposed to a reference that is potentially going to teach someone something. But again, it's also something that reminds me, like whenever I'm trying to remember where these verses are from, in some ways it gives me the opportunity to remind myself. So this piece in particular, it's kind of riddled with various different mentions of examples, narrations, verses, or stories about Imam Ali, and that's why I particularly like it, because I've tried to weave them throughout. And if you do look at the whole piece, you might be able to see that. If we can skip the next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. So, concluding remarks. As one of the sisters at the beginning said, poetry is an amana. And I think reminding myself that you're handling people's emotions, which is important, but don't let accuracy be compromised. It's very easy to focus on emotion and say things that might not actually be historically accurate, or might lead someone to think something that isn't in line with kind of very well established Islamic philosophy. So the importance of accuracy and emotion, especially when it comes to presenting to people. Sincerity is, again, a concept that should be underpinning everything that we do. And the final point is, when you write, choose what you want to leave on your audience, whether it be a story, a reflection, a feeling, and let the process be transformative for yourself as well as it will be for other people. And with that being said, I would like to take a big break and thank you all for your time. If we have time, I think we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we'll move to questions, but first, before we move to questions, I wanted to thank you, Rameez. That was a very, very insightful workshop. I know I learned a lot from it. I'm sure everyone else here as well. So really appreciate you taking the time out and presenting this for us. And I appreciate everyone else who came out for this as well. Before we move to questions, just a last little plug. If you don't follow Poets of the Household already, please follow our social media pages so you can keep up to date with our different programs. We have workshops, we have a podcast, we have writing prompts, and we're going to be coming up with more programming in the coming months as well. Our next workshop is tentatively scheduled for end of January, early Feb, and Sister Batul Rizvi is also on the call, is going to be running that one. It's going to be covering forms and specifically exploring ghazal in the English language. So keep an eye out for that post for the next workshop. And inshallah, we'll move over to questions for Brother Rameez.
Looking forward to the next workshop as well. And Sister Batul, I've seen a lot of your work, so I'm looking forward to that as well. And by the way, I'm very sorry I've neglected the chat in some ways. If there are any questions that you guys had posted earlier that you want to kind of mention, please do feel free to repost, just because I might have missed. I will look from like a couple scrolls up. Comment on the previous piece, you mentioned Ali was included and towards the end to close off that bit could have been, but Ali concluded. That's an interesting idea. I think that could work. And I think that's one of the beauties of poetry, that you can write the same thing two different ways and it can still convey a good meaning. My pleasure. Thank you for engaging. Ali's asking, is the Discord active?
No, so we changed a few months ago. We changed from Discord to WhatsApp. It's been kind of like a soft launch. We were kind of seeing where it goes, but I will post more details on our main Instagram account for the WhatsApp group that I think Rameez mentioned as well earlier in his presentation. But we moved from Discord to WhatsApp.
Sister Anam, you said, can you repeat the technique you used in the poem about God and understanding Him? Do you mind reminding me of which technique it was? I'm sorry, like which concept it was, and then I can try to remind myself. And yeah, the idea of close reading is really important as well. I feel like our demographic, meaning young people in the Western world, have very short attention spans. So we sometimes struggle for kind of sitting down and exploring a piece in depth, myself definitely included. But there might be more that meets the eye when it comes to some particular pieces, especially when it comes to things that are closer to just have I guess more divine proximity, be that Holy Quran, be that du'as, etc. Thank you, brother Muhammad. It's very kind of you. 5-week intensive, but I'm sure it feels like you guys have been through a 5-week intensive after today. Some of today was very, very intense, so I appreciate you guys being so engaged, and yeah, honestly, I'm really, really grateful. And I'm asking you what you said about it. I think the last few lines. I will go through. and I will try to let you know if that's okay. Thank you very much, Sister Anmol. Peaceful. Okay, so the best sound illustration. The ism one was more so wordplay. That's what I would take.
I have a
And,
question.
please.
Sorry. What's the best piece of advice that you feel like you've received in terms of poetry or feedback that you've received that you'd like to share?
That's a very good question. I would say use poetry or ensure that poetry is a means for staying grounded and introspection rather than a means for performance and entertainment. The reason is that a lot of poets, and I've fallen short of this as well, when they write, and especially kind of early on, when I was early on, I still am very early on, but during my previous phases of writing, I feel like I was very much thinking, how would an audience perceive this? How would my audience hear this? How can I make an audience cry? How can I make an audience smile, laugh? And there's nothing inherently bad about that, because these are skills in and of itself. And I think good poetry uses the ability to kind of mold and change people's emotions. But once I felt like I'd grasped that stuff, I very quickly wanted to turn it introspective and write in a way that I feel like I'm taking myself on a journey. And it might be because of the fact that I felt like I grasped this stuff because of that phase in my life and that phase in my writing, that I was able to incorporate it into my writing without that much difficulty. But now I feel like the fruits of writing are so much sweeter, because I'm writing and almost going through like a mental dilemma and putting it onto paper and sharing it with people, and people are relating to it, and that is powerful. It's just nice to feel like you're actually adding clarity to your headspace and potentially bringing someone else into that clarity. So that's probably the biggest thing that I would say. I've heard from a few different scholars that kind of have been very big supporters, big inspirations, I should say.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a question in relation to like I noticed there were a lot of like creative elements and like how you mentioned show and not tell and like that whole like philosophy. Um, how do you go about this process of like starting out with like such because like I was honestly really inspired by the all of the creative elements that you kind of included. And the only perception that I had personally was of like someone from the audience recognizing something that was like basically out of my worldview. So how do you go about crafting those creative elements within your poetry?
It's meaning like how do you go about incorporating them into the poetry?
Yeah, like
Like,
you know how you mentioned like weaving references and stuff?
mm-hmm.
Like how do you go about starting that process of like what's the mindset going into like starting a poem?
Okay. I would say the the pieces that I've presented today, the majority of them came from a concept. So I tried to establish a concept first. Um, let's say only the Knights truly knew Ali, for example. Just using that example, the concept was Imam Ali is such a the almost a dichotomy between the simplicity of Imam Ali's lifestyle and also the complexity of what he was able to achieve and what he was actually like in different contexts, and the adaptability. So in my head, I wanted to convey the fact that the only thing that knew Imam Ali was the idea of nighttime, right? The idea of darkness, the idea of essentially the the hidden. The hidden can understand Imam Ali because so much of himself was in that space. So I had the concept firstly in my head. Then I tried to seek references that either I feel that I could link into that, or references that very obviously reflected that. So, for example, in the piece, I talk about the idea of Imam Ali going out in the nighttime to deliver food to the poor and the destitute. I talked about Imam Ali sleeping at nighttime in the Holy Prophet's clothes, as when he was kind of called upon to protect him from like the enemies that wanted to attack the Holy Prophet. So the idea of sleep, the idea of nighttime, the idea of like darkness, any references that I found in that realm, I tried to collect and collate, or ones that involved concepts that I can, using just like creativity, that I can drag into this realm, be that light, be that candlelight, be that softness, those kind of concepts I try to bring into that realm. And then a case of how you deliver it, it depends on, I guess, how you can creatively think about those references in the context of your topic. So that's a bit that comes with practice, I would say. The rest of it is probably just like theory. Like one can collect these references and link them to a topic. That's not the difficult bit, I would say, so much. But the once you have all of that and you have the foundations of that, linking it into a piece using your creative techniques, your literary techniques, that's the bit that I would say probably comes with the practice. But don't like your insight, for example, is excellent, mashallah. Like, so I don't think you'd have any difficulty with that, if I'm honest, because you're able to see things and read into things that past the first level. I feel like if someone struggles to read something beyond the first level, that's when I would think, you know what, it might be a little bit of a challenge to creatively link that into your piece. But yeah, it goes without saying, but anyone here I'd love to learn from you guys as well, from your pieces. So if there's anything that you guys have that I can be of assistance of, please do let me know. I'm on Instagram, as you guys have seen, so please do get in touch if there's anything that I can share or bounce ideas off. I think the final question may be the favorite literary technique. I like alliteration. Short and sweet. I feel like alliteration is just such an easy and such a flexible, and you can use that in so many different ways. So I'd probably say that. I think that would probably conclude the talk today. Thank you very much.